Hi everybody, welcome back to the Millcreek Government Channel. I'm Jessica James, and here today we have a dear friend in the studio to talk about one of my favorite topics, Lake Erie shipwrecks. And if you have not met him already, we have Dave Boughton here with us today. And Dave, you are the Maritime Education Manager for the Pennsylvania Sea Grant.
That is correct.
Right?
It's good to see you, Jess.
It's good to see you too. We're so excited to have you back, and I'm so glad to have props. Props are one of my favorite things. So thank you for joining us here today, and I know you have a lot going on, and we can just jump right into it because we had a lot of discussions before the show even started, and we need to get our viewers into the loop.
Right.
So just go ahead and tell me about what project you're working on right now.
Well, I'm so excited that you asked me to come in and share some of the projects we're up to, because we have had for about the last 2 months, we have hosted a Great Lakes shipwreck exhibit at the Ridge Center on the second floor, and it's just been a fantastic exhibit, and we've learned a lot from it, and we've had really genuinely, appreciative outpour from the community, and it's been so much fun. So it started on February 1st, and I think within the first 3 weeks we'd had just over almost 6,000 people. So we'd broken all of the records at the Ridge Center for that same period of time, and that's standing up against the the dinosaur exhibits and so forth. So you should never underestimate the public's interest in shipwrecks.
Absolutely not. And I was telling you, it's one of my favorite topics, whether it's, Lake Erie shipwrecks, Great Lakes shipwrecks, or even shipwrecks off of Key West.
Yes.
They're all my favorite. So you said it opened up in February, and when did it go?
And it went through the 22nd of April.
Okay.
So we had approximately 3 months. And, it was open from like 10 to 6, 7 days a week, and it was free admission. We had a number of collaborators that worked with us on it. So we brought a number of the community stakeholders together. Primarily, it was the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, which run the Ridge Center. So, and they maintain the gallery there for this exhibit, and it was the first in-house exhibit that they'd done versus hosting other people's exhibits. So that was a first. And so I worked very closely with the staff there, the environmental educators, and also we had the Erie Maritime Museum, obviously, which has a stake in this. The Erie County Historical Society also contributed display cases and some of their artifacts. I think it began with a set of 11 panels that had been developed by New York Sea Grant, and they had been on tour as a rotating gallery in New York, and I got permission to utilize those, and then from there it just kind of built various components onto the shipwreck exhibit itself. So the panels were wonderful because they spoke Great Lakes wide of shipwrecks in various freshwater lakes, even outside of the Great Lakes, the Finger Lakes, Lake Champlain, the St. Lawrence Seaway, and they talked about whose stuff is it? What is the conservation science, all the different angles of shipwrecks, and it was a wonderful collection. So how about do we have time to discuss the various components of the shipwreck?
Absolutely. There were different exhibits, and so we can kind of get into that. And you think, and I guess this is a personal question for myself, do you think you'll hold the exhibit again in the future because it was so successful?
Well, I think there's a lot of interest in having a permanent display, and that was one of the common threads. We have a comment book at the exhibit, and there's just been some wonderful entries from people from all over, and including some European visitors, And one of the common themes was, let's find a permanent home for these exhibits. So it is my hope that, some of the displays that we've established and some of the artifacts that we've been able to get on loan for display will carry down to the Erie Maritime Museum, which to me is the place that they belong. And I know Captain Ripka there, who's director, has always had an interest in having a shipwreck display, and especially with the Tall Ship program coming in September.
Right, coming back again. I'm excited about that. I went to the last one, and it was wonderful. So we have a lot of artifacts on the table today.
We do.
And do these artifacts tie in with each of the exhibit panels that you were talking about then?
They do. We have one of the display cabinets that is specific to the artifacts, which I'd like to talk about these items. Where they came from, what they are, and how they fit into the whole shipwreck story. But hey, let's start at the top, Jess, and let's talk about you know, the first components for the visitor that would walk into the Ridge Center, they would be greeted by what most people call a cannon. Well, it is a cannon to the layman, but it's actually a 32-pound carronade, and it's from the 1913 reconstruction of the U.S. brig Niagara. So she'd been sunk in Misery Bay for 100 years, and when the centennial came up, the objective was to raise the ship and tow her around the Great Lakes and go to different ports of call to celebrate the Battle of Lake Erie, the War of 1812. And so the ship went through an extensive renovation at that point, and during that period, they recasted 16 of these 32-pound carronades.
That's incredible.
And put them on the ship. Now, they're not firing replicas, but this is one of the actual ones that was on the ship. So that greets the visitors that came into the shipwreck exhibit. And then adjacent to it, the perfect thing for a shipwreck exhibit, we have the ship's wheel. So,
and these are large items, right? You told us how much they weigh, but they are.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you what,
large.
getting that carronade into the Ridge Center was no small task. You know, it took a whole crew to get that in. But the ship's wheel was a representative example of a typical ship's wheel from a mid-18th century schooner. So, and it's something that the children could turn and actually get their hands on, and that was a lot of fun.
And Dave, if you don't mind, real fast, you mentioned the word schooner. Can you kind of describe what type of ship or boat that looks like?
Yes. Well, you know, in the early days, it was all by sail, and a schooner was the typical vessel that plied the Great Lakes waters for commerce and transportation, shipping, and so forth. You know, there were no engines, so they were ships of sail, otherwise known as tall ships. There were brigs, there were schooners, various size ships with different sail configurations. But I think that the schooner was the most typical of the Great Lakes sailing vessels from about the, the late 1700s through to about the 1880s when steam was introduced and they went to the paddle wheels.
Perfect.
So yeah, good question.
Okay.
So, and then we start on to the exploration and discovery. So this cabinet had displayed a hard hat diver's helmet. It had some scuba equipment. It had some of the student-built remotely operated vehicles that we use in our surveys.
And we've seen those before.
And
those are the robots that you brought into the studio once before.
Were made by 8th grade students, and we proudly put those into the water, and we like to make that connection with the students as a, because I'm an educator, and that's how I view things. So, but this year it was so exciting because we've received this grant funding to do an inventory of all the shipwrecks in Lake Erie from Coastal Zone Management. So now we'd received some funding, and I was able to find a commercial grade ROV, remotely operated vehicle, that we could use to do these shipwrecks with HD cameras. And the difference was with the student ROVs, they had a limitation of 40 feet.
Okay.
And we do have some shipwrecks within that range, but most of them are, 60 to 100 feet.
Right, and Lake Erie is the shallowest of the Great
correct.
Lakes, correct? And how deep is Lake Erie again?
It averages about 60 feet in the middle basin, and has I think it's a 241-foot hole across the long point.
Right.
So yeah. So this new ROV has an extension of 150 feet, so I can take it down to a shipwreck at 100 feet and still have 50 feet of play to do a flyover where we can gather HD images and put together a photo mosaic. So we're really excited, and this will be the first season we've had that to work with.
And what is the range? And you mentioned that the student ROVs only went down to about 40 feet. Now, the average diver can go down to what, 30 to 60 feet?
60 before dealing with the decompression.
Okay,
right.
all right. So then you're going way further
Yes.
than what regular scuba divers can do.
Right, and then instead of putting the dive survey team at risk, when we can go down and capture the visual images, which are a part of our survey, all the better said there. So.
And you do have some good images that we can show our viewers too.
Yeah, that we can share with your visitors, and some that were taken by other divers that they shared with us, And that's pretty much what this exhibition existed. It was for folks that would come to the Ridge Center that would possibly never go diving, never get in a boat, but they still learned to appreciate the maritime history of the area. And there were other people that had been, immersed in that through time and had something to do with it, that had their own stories to share, which was the payback for us. And we collected this data, and it's very important, and it's a part of this whole survey work we're doing, is to collect this information,
Right, right. So you've got the exploration and discovery, and then you've got some shipwreck diving videos?
Yes.
Okay.
So as a part of the Pennsylvania Archaeological and Shipwreck Survey Team, which has received this funding through the Regional Science Consortium, which is a research wing of the Ridge Center, We've received this funding, and we've set up the dive team. Our videographer's name is Jeremy Bannister, and he has been, always interested in filming and does a really nice job. He has been able to document the footage of some of the surveys we've been doing, so people actually have this visual, exploration of the wreck. So he's actually been able to film the process by which we take the measurements, establish a datum point on the wreck site, and triangulate its position, GPS, and go through the work that we do underneath the water. So he had put together, I think it was a total of 14 short videos between 5 and 7 minutes of some of the very well-known wrecks in the area, but then also some that people probably haven't heard of. So.
And those videos are only being shown right now at the Tom Ridge Center, or do you think they would be available on YouTube at any point?
They are currently available on YouTube, but they are also going to be a part of our education and outreach. As a part of this grant, we are putting together a website which will list all of the wreck sites in our quadrangle between Ohio, New York, and the Canadian border. And we will have that video in addition to archival videos that we've obtained through this exhibit period, which will be very exciting to have a basis of comparison of the ships, what they were 30 years ago and what they look like today.
Wow, that's crazy,
It's
and I just love this. It is so interesting.
Yes.
So you've got the artifact, or you've got the shipwreck panel display, and then the shipwreck artifact cases.
Yes, and now we're getting to that. So let's touch base on the, well, we've really talked about the panel display, which was the 11 panels that were provided by a New York Sea grant. So the other main display case that was provided by the Erie County Historical Society, we also were able to display some original pieces from the U.S. brig Niagara.
Oh, man.
So, Jesse, when she came out in 1913 for a rebuild, she had been sunk for 100 years. And to get that vessel afloat again basically required replacing the majority of the structural timbers. So at that time, there wasn't a lot of forethought about, well, what do we do with these original pieces? So they were cast off. We were able to get 3 of the original 1812 timbers that had been bestowed upon or given to the Historical Society, and we've got those on display.
Wow.
Okay, and with actual pictures of the ship as she was raised in 1913. So that's very exciting. And I've also brought in these artifacts to share with you today. And there's a point to this, okay? Sometimes we know what artifacts are, and sometimes we don't. So we had a show and tell aspect of the exhibit. We had several public days where the public was invited to bring in things they may have found, or been given to them, or that they found on the beach, or passed down in the family. Something was sitting on their mantle, perhaps, and share them with the public. But most importantly, to have them identified by archaeologists to determine what exactly they were. They were mystery pieces. So people had found stuff that had been washed up on shore, things that their grandfather had given them. So they started bringing in a number of these artifacts. And the point that's to be made with this portion of the exhibit is that it's really illegal to remove anything from a shipwreck.
Right.
Legally and ethically, because each of these shipwrecks represent a maritime gravesite, potentially. So there's...
Right. There's a lot of feeling with that, and I know it's, maybe these shipwrecks are 200 years old, but we were saying, people perished on these shipwrecks.
Right.
You have to respect that this is now their resting site and their grave. So,
exactly.
If you come across something like this, you don't want to just pillage it and take what you can and, and display it, but, just to have a sense of respect for what was lost down there.
And this is what we want to communicate. That's exactly what we want people to take away from this. And unfortunately, the Abandoned Shipwreck Act wasn't enacted and in place until 1988. So there was a period of time where recreational divers had the ability, and the state did not have the oversight to police the diving that went on these wrecks. Right. And there was a period in time, even before scuba, where people were able to look at some of the nearshore wrecks and take things off the wreck and turn them in for scrap. There was no association with any real value. We're not talking about treasure chests. We're talking about pieces of the ship and interesting items. So there were a lot of divers that went out themselves and they found shipwrecks, and they'd go down, and there's something that happens to a diver when they get down on a wreck. They must have a souvenir, and it's something that is important to overcome and to understand the things that we've discussed that make shipwrecks important.
Right.
So So we brought in some things today. And some of these things were brought in by folks that had been on the wrecks, as I said, in the 70s and 80s. Other things we recovered at Presque Isle. And may we start with the artifacts and talk about them?
I'm excited to talk about this first one.
Yes.
I know that I've ended up with something like this on my coffee table. It's funny how we all acquire these different things, but go ahead and tell me what this is so I know what I've got on my coffee table.
Well, this is considered a block, and this would have been a part of the rigging on a schooner. So this is the same type of a pulley system that would have been in a barn, on a farm, typical of that. But this came off a shipwreck, okay?
And you know that because of the way it's been weathered?
We do, but there's an interesting story behind it, too.
Okay.
Everything has a story to tell here, Jesse. So this came to the Maritime Museum in a box with a number of artifacts that were obviously, mid-18th century schooner artifacts. A little old lady came in, she sat them on the counter, and she turned around and started to walk out. Well, the staff chased her out because they like to give them letters of thanks and appreciate the fact that she taught them in, and she didn't want to talk to anybody.
Okay.
And what had happened, Jesse, is this woman's husband had been a diver in the very early days, and he had this collection of things that he'd taken off of ships. And she always had a problem with that. And she realized that that was probably not the right thing to do. And when he passed away, instead of throwing all these items away, she thought enough to take them down to the Maritime Museum, that which should have the state responsibility for them, and turn them over. Now, here's the problem with that, is that we have some great representative artifacts from shipwrecks, but we have no idea what ships they're from.
Right, right.
So what they lose, and when they're taken from the ship, they lose their story. So they lose what we call their provenance. You know, there's no connection to the shipwreck. This is a rusty block.
Right.
So historically, it's not considered evidence of any one particular shipwreck because it's not connected with the site. It wasn't examined, collected, and documented by a marine archaeologist. So that was the point of this display case, is to look at items and tell the difference between the things that we know that came from a place and those that don't. So, so this is an example of something that was collected early in the by a recreational diver, but we have no idea what shipwreck this came from.
And it's hard because that's wooden. So, you know, some of those different pieces that might have been metal, where you could maybe still see the name of the shipwreck on it. That's not
Because really, if you think about it, a shipwreck, what is the identifying feature of a shipwreck? Well, in the schooners, you had the ship's bell, and you had the name on the transom or the stern of the ship. Well, if that's not there, what other ways do you have to tell? So there are a lot of mystery wrecks that we still have not identified exactly what ships they were. So.
Okay, what do we got next?
Well, here's an example of what we call a composite here, Jesse. This is a collection of both wood and metal. So
looks heavy.
It is, and when we look at the preservation of these artifacts, this is the most difficult type of piece, a composite, because of the presence of both the iron and the wooden material. So what you would do to preserve the wood in this artifact would damage the iron, and what you would do to preserve the iron would damage the wood. So it's a very difficult piece to preserve.
So do you leave it untouched, or do you make a sacrifice of one material over another?
We do spot preservation, but the first thing, anything wood that comes out of the water, and this was turned in by a person who found it floating up on the beach. And so the first thing we did was get it out of the weather and put it into a long drying process to make sure all the water was out. And then we are going to spot preserve the iron material, and we have not yet determined the best method to deal with the wood now. So we're, consulting with different conservation agencies to how to do that.
And you just said this floated on shore.
Yeah, this floated up inshore into someone's property, and there's people that walk the beaches, they look for beach glass, but somebody had the presence of mind to look at this and realize must be something besides a piece of a dock or something. And we've come to learn what they are as people brought in other pieces. Some pieces were brought in and you could just smell the creosote on them. That was not shipwreck material. The placement of the iron, the type of heads on the nails, the placement within the artifact itself, because this was a structural piece of a schooner. And a number of pieces have come in from the west side of the peninsula And I'm thinking if they keep on coming, we'll be able to put the whole ship back
I
together,
hope
and you and I
so.
can go for a sail.
I would love that.
How
I
about
hope
that?
so. This is actually a very, very heavy piece.
Yes. Well, these are plank nails here, so we can look at the depth here to determine the size of the planking. These are called drift pins here. So we know what these items were used, and they were used for about a 150-year period. And but we can get an idea of what the structure of the ship was. Now that. Well, I guess we should talk about the rest of the artifacts here first.
Okay, go ahead. What do we got here? What do these do? These look like maybe pedestals to a table?
Oh, that's what I was going to ask you, is to take a wild guess here, Jess. Now,
that would be my guess.
Pedestal to a table.
Pedestal to a table.
All right. Do you see a similarity between these two pieces, although they're different in configuration? Functionally, do you think that there might be some connection there?
I do. I mean, they look like whatever they were holding was probably the same size.
Yeah.
Although this, and I could be wrong about this looks a little older and where this looks more modern. It's just because of the way it's rounded versus
Yeah, you're very
a
perceptive
straight
there.
piece. But that's just a
Well,
wild guess.
There's one thing that most ships had in common before the onset of steam and electricity, so this would be back in the schooner range, all right? They all needed a place to create warmth and to cook food. So
is
that
it
would have
In more of like a boiler or fireplace?
potbelly stove.
Okay.
So all schooners had a potbelly stove that was in the galley. That's what they used for cooking. And it was also a place where the sailors could warm up. And in addition, these were at archaeological sites down at Presque Isle and were found in the water. But there was also a whole bunch of houseboats in Misery Bay. Each of those houseboats in the early 1900s very likely also had potbelly stoves.
Okay.
So is this associated with a specific shipwreck? No, but it's a good example. And you're right, this piece right here is older than this piece right here. We've actually been able to document the actual stove type and the date that this one came off of, and we're still researching this one here.
And what is the date on this one?
This is 1898 right here.
1898.
Into about 1920s. The company that produced these, and they were right out of Pennsylvania too. So
Were they?
Yes. So let me stick with the archaeological sites down
Okay.
at Presque Isle and share some of these pieces with you. Now, down at the area between Misery Bay and Graveyard Pond is a very busy area at Presque Isle. And we have a number of volunteers that help out down there. And there was a day when one of the volunteers found some material floating in the water here. And she picked this up and she turned it in and said, you know, I found this in the water. There's a bunch of these pieces here. So we're wondering what this is. And I immediately recognized it by its shape as a ship spike, period ship spike. But it came with these large concretions on them from being submerged in the water for so long. So we took these up and we did a complete survey of the area with metal detectors, not removing anything that wasn't already washed out in the bank. But we found a series of structures. Every meter we found these iron deposits. So, you know, it's indicative of some type of shipbuilding or breaking material. So the old legend of Graveyard Pond being a resting place for sailors, we've come to think more in terms of a resting place for ships.
Okay.
So of all the reconstruction, instruction that was going on. So
Sure.
these items go through the conservation science process back in the Regional Science Consortium lab, where we set them up in an electrolysis tank. They'll sit there for up to 2 weeks, and then they'll come through and they'll go into a science oven and heat it to displace the water. Then we treat them with a tannic acid solution to further displace water, and then we complete them with a microcrystalline wax. So initially they come out of the sites looking like this, and then after the full conservation measure, they end up like this,
Wow.
and completely devoid of any oxidation because they've been cleared and sealed. So that's exciting.
And that's a huge difference. I mean, from these, you just aren't really sure what you've got here.
Yes.
And then from this, I mean, it looks
You can
clear
identify
as
it.
day that it
Sure.
was
Yeah, and this is a
keep the ship
drift
together.
pin. This was used in timbers to put them together. We have 3 of them in this composite right here. And there was no wood material that came out of the archaeological sites, interestingly. It was all metal material.
That is interesting. And what's this big one we've got?
Well, I've kind of saved this for last because this is very exciting. This came into the show and tell portion. We were doing living history interviews, and an old diver came in and said that he'd picked this up off the Charles Foster. Okay, and he turned this in and said, this is a fire axe right here. And I thought it's so odd because if you can look right here, you can see that its head can swivel. And I couldn't understand what the function of a fire axe would be for that. It's all metal.
Yeah.
It has a ring at one side. And after looking into it and consulting with the archaeologist, we found that this was called commonly a horsey iron. and it had another name as well. This was a shipwright tool that was used with two men as they were setting the oakum seam in that of a wooden ship. So they would pound this here, and it'd be another guy with a sledge here. He would run it along the seam, and they would pound this threaded oakum in between the planks on the ship to seal it.
Wow.
And so it's a very unique piece that was a part of every shipwright's toolbox.
And is this whole piece metal?
It's all metal.
It's all metal, and it's very heavy also.
It is. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Feel that. Yeah.
Oh man. I mean, and the weird part about shipwrecks and the artifacts that you bring up is, you did say it's all metal, but this is almost starting to look like wood a little bit.
Yes, this is in need of preservation, so we'll be sending that in. Okay.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. So listen, we've got, do we have time for a quick story there?
I would love a story. I know we are running so
yes.
out of time quickly here, but I would love a story. Please.
Can I talk real fast and tell you this story? I'm so excited to tell you because I've talked and so every shipwreck has a story, okay? And as a result of this research, stories have been shared with us. So a gentleman came into the shipwreck exhibit and he says, I want to learn about the Lake Erie submarine. And I said, well, I'm not familiar with the Lake Erie submarine. I said, you may be thinking of the Confederate submarine from Charleston Harbor. And he said, yes, there was two of them, and one of them sunk in Lake Erie. And I said, no, I don't believe so, but this led me to look into it. And as it turns out, in 1852, Laudner Darvantis Phillips, from a cobbler family, had invented a submarine. He brought it to Erie. He was in the business of salvaging the wreck of the Atlantic, which had money in the safe.
Right.
And there were salvers right on there, and it drew a lot of people to try to retrieve it. He went down in a 40-foot submarine that he built to retrieve and salvage that. It went down once, sprung a leak, it came back up. They did another test. The line broke at the bottom, and that submarine sunk and is laying beside the Atlantic to this day in the whole off a long point. Yes.
Oh my gosh. And did at first people think that was one big shipwreck, but it's really two?
It's a whole separate incident.
Oh man.
But it was 2 years after the Atlantic sunk. So it's a very exciting story, of which there are many. And I'm grateful to be able to be the guy that tells those stories and shares them with you.
I would like you to come back and just share the stories because, you just told this one of the submarine. The Atlantic is one of my favorite stories. It's very tragic, but it's, to me, very much like the Titanic. So, Dave, we need to have you back on the show. We have so much to talk about that we didn't even get to touch on today. Folks, I hope that you get to, or you were able to make it down to the Tom Ridge Environmental Center to check out these artifacts. Please go online and check out Pennsylvania Sea Grant's website. Dave has so many great, interesting stories. If you see any artifacts, feel free to give him a call. Dave, go ahead, just real quick, tell us how people can contact you if something washes on shore and they want to show it to you.
I can be reached at area code 814-720-0746, and my email is dbb11@psu.edu.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, and as I promised, this was a wonderful, wonderful show. Thank you so much for tuning into the Millcreek Government Channel today. And until next time, have a wonderful day.
You're watching the Millcreek Government Channel, powered by WQLN Public Media.